Yesterday in Parliament, under privilege, the Prime Minister described the deputy opposition leader, as the Manchurian candidate. How does the panel hold that in context against other cabinet ministers in the Liberal government? Say, for example, Andrew Robb, who was the then Trade Minister, who was responsible for the approval of the Darwin port and signed off on it, and then immediately afterwards left and took a job working for the Landbridge Company, a CCP associated company, and went off and took a job with them immediately after making that decision. Does it really matter that China is attempting to place candidates in our democratic process when sitting members of our Australian Parliament are so easily purchased?
Yeah, thanks for the question. A lot to that. Greg Sheridan, I'll start with you.
Well, Stan, look, that's a great question. So I am very critical of Scott Morrison for uttering the words Manchurian candidate. They were absolutely wrong. He said them about Richard Marles. Richard Marles is a patriotic Australian. He doesn't serve any national interest other than Australia's. We ought to note that the Prime Minister immediately withdrew the comment. It was a stupid thing to say. Generally, this week, I think the government has substantially overdone its China rhetoric. And it's right to be critical of China, although I think the rhetoric is overdone. But it's wrong to say the Labor Party has been disloyal or un-Australian or not followed Australia's interests while it's in opposition. I give the Albanese opposition high marks. They supported AUKUS, they support nuclear-powered submarines. The opposition in the last term opposed the extradition treaty, which the Turnbull government was trying to ratify with the Chinese government. However, I think the government is perfectly entitled to subject Labor's actual record on national security to withering scrutiny. In its last term of government, Labor cut the defence budget to record lows. It said we desperately needed 12 regionally superior subs and then started ripping money out of defence and did nothing towards the subs. It had a catastrophic failure on border security. So that seems to me more than enough for the coalition to be going on with. I think making up these silly charges of, Labor serving someone else's national interest, I think that's wrong. I think it's unfair to the Labor Party, and I think it devalues the rhetoric of national security.
Chris Bowen.
Well, thank you, Magnus. I've been in Parliament a while, and it's probably the grubbiest thing I have seen in Parliament. It was utterly disgraceful, inaccurate and appalling. And of course we face geopolitical challenges from China and Russia. But I'll tell you what our biggest asset as a country is. It's actually not our military hardware. It's actually not many things that you might think of. It's our national unity. The fact that we come together as one in the national interest. And the Labor Party has done that consistently. And to undermine that in Parliament is utterly appalling. Dennis Richardson, probably our most esteemed former diplomat, former head of ASIO, former ambassador to the United States, former head of Defence and DFAT, Department of Foreign Affairs, said it was beyond grubby. And he's right. And it's also inaccurate. I mean, Andrew's here. Perhaps Andrew could explain to all of us what policy difference there is between the Labor Party and the government on China. Is it South China Sea? No. Is it Taiwan? No. Is it Hong Kong? No. Is it extradition treaty? No. We blocked the extradition treaty the Liberals wanted to put through. Is it Huawei? No. On every single strategic matter, the Labor Party has acted in the national interest. There has not been one policy difference. So it is utterly irresponsible, deeply reprehensible and entirely inaccurate. And frankly, it's desperado stuff from the government in the lead up to the election. They are questioning people's patriotism as an act of political desperation.
I'll go to Andrew in a minute, but what about the substance? Greg raised some questions there about commitment to defence, sure, supporting defence, defence spending, and given what you've outlined, and indeed you've been criticised by your former Prime Minister Paul Keating for being too in lockstep with the government when it comes to China, why would the Global Times, the mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party, say would prefer a Labor government?
Well, that article was actually written by an Australian, to be clear, and what they said about what they said about Scott Morrison was probably more complimentary than most of the text messages we've seen from his cabinet colleagues. So let's keep that in context. And in relation, we're happy to have a national security debate. I mean, this government's had 6 defence ministers in 8 years. They've had massive blowouts. They've had 3 attempts at a submarine deal. I mean, they've got two wrong, and now that we're expected to believe that the third one is the right one, all of a sudden, when they've had three goes. And one of the most challenging national security challenges for our country and our region is climate change. I mean, we live in the region most impacted by climate change in terms of impact on population. There are literally hundreds of millions of people in Indonesia who will have their homes inundated by rising sea levels. This is a national security challenge. We're putting aside even the Pacific. And they have no national security and climate change strategy, and we will. So I'm happy to have our records compared and our plans compared. Every Labor leader since 2013 has been committed to 2% of GDP being spent on defence. That's a bipartisan commitment. We can have a legitimate discussion and debate about national security.
It's probably going to require more than that, isn't it?
Well, but we can have a legitimate debate about all these things. But I'll tell you what we can't do and should not do. A legitimate debate about the patriotism of either side of politics. It's disgusting. That is not legitimate.
Let me just stay with you, though. If there's not a difference in policy or approach to China, is there a difference in the way that it's communicated or a difference in emphasis? I want to take you to what Penny Wong said last year when she was delivering her landmark speech on Australia's place in the world at the Australian National University. And she said, expressing who we are in narrow and exclusionary terms can inhibit potential for alignment, and it can diminish the cohesion in the Australian community. And she pointed this out. Recall Tony Abbott's championing of the Anglosphere and how that was perceived in the region. What's wrong with the Anglosphere, which has been the bedrock of Australian security since Australia for the last 200 years?
No, I'm familiar with that speech from Penny. It's a very good speech. And our view is you can do these things. We support AUKUS. We also support deeper...
But why criticise it publicly in a way that we know when China criticises America or Australia, it precisely talks about things like that?
Well, Stan, if I could make the point, we don't believe it's an either-or. You can support AUKUS and also support deeper engagement in the region. Our policy is to have a special envoy to ASEAN, for example, and to lift our level of engagement in ASEAN. The Southeast Asian region is where the geopolitical contest is actually going to be at its sharpest edge. We believe in deeper engagement. We believe AUKUS has a role. We believe the Quad has a role. We believe ASEAN has a role. We believe APEC, which is we take a lot of pride in the Labor Party, has a role as well. These are all important institutions. But as I said, what we don't do is divide. I mean, we've had a government senator, Senator Abetz, require Australians of Chinese heritage to affirm their loyalty to the country when they're giving evidence before a Senate committee. Didn't ask anybody else, didn't ask any Anglo-Celtic people. It was utterly disgusting. This is my point about division. We have a great asset in Australia, it's our unity. And part of that unity is bipartisanship, wherever possible, in the national interest. We've provided it. I mean, the government doesn't know how to take yes for an answer. I mean, we say yes to these things and they still, because they see a little potential focus group driven political opportunity, they decide to question the patriotism of good Australians and they decide to rip up that unity. And it sends a terrible message to our allies, because one of the most important messages to our allies is governments can change, but important fundamentals are respected. There's an old saying that Labor Prime Ministers and Liberal Prime Ministers have good relationships with Democratic and Republican presidents, and it's true. But when a government says if the next election the government changes, it undermines that understanding of our allies. And I'll go back to my opening point. It is deeply, deeply irresponsible. And I would really like to hear what the matter of policy difference is between the government and the opposition on these matters, because frankly, there isn't one.
Andrew Constance, why are we hearing this rhetoric? This, as Greg has said, using language like the Manchurian candidate and how damaging that can be. Why are we seeing this tack?
Well, first of all, those words were withdrawn, and that's appropriate. This country needs to be very strong in its position, its language, its determination, its sovereignty, and we can't continue to see what we're seeing. We have an incredible engagement across the region. There is without doubt. But the coercive pressure that we are under and how that's going to play out on households to critical supplies, it wouldn't matter if it was fertiliser for farmers. We've seen the AdBlue issue. It is going to mean, as a country, we have to be very sensitive to our critical supplies and that engagement. We do not want to continue to see the coercive economic pressure that we are seeing. There is no doubt...
Politically, was this a mistake?
Beg your pardon?
Politically, was this a mistake, using that sort of language? And we've seen, we've seen the chief of ASIO even coming out and warning against the dangers of using this type of language or intelligence in this way.
Well, certainly I think we should be listening to the experts in terms of ASIO. There's no ifs or buts in that regard. But what I would say, certainly, is there's no room for loose language. There should be no sanctions out of China on Australia in any form, and we should be firm on that. In terms of what we're seeing in Europe at this point, I mean, to think that the Ukraine had a National Unity Day yesterday, which we should have all stood so firmly as a world, looking at those young people saying, you know, we're looking to the West, we're not looking to the East, and the old-style USSR.
I'll get you to hold that thought, because we are going to come to the question of Russia. Can I just come back to you, Magnus, on that? And you had your hand up, so you obviously want to respond in some way. But the second part of your question as well, when it came to Andrew Robb, I want to point out as well, it was the Northern Territory government that signed off on that deal when it came to the ports. And Andrew Robb, of course, no longer works in that position. But what are your concerns there about former politicians working for Chinese companies, potential influence and interference? And what about what you've heard here tonight?
To the first part? Yeah, I think there's definitely, and most Australians would say this, I think, there's definitely a problem in the political system around politicians being able to take advisory and lobbying roles after they leave Parliament. This is a massive issue. And I think the other thing I really just wanted to say, I think when you were asking about the language of the Manchurian candidate, I think when you look at the context of that statement, but also a Prime Minister who held up a piece of coal in federal parliament when there's a rule around no props. The only thing that shows greater disrespect for the democracy and the parliamentary process is the fact that he scheduled so few parliamentary days.
Well, as Tony Jones would have said, I'll take that as a comment, but we are going to come back to the question of coal in a minute, Allegra. Yeah.
And I wanted to make thank you for raising that point, and that point about integrity and the revolving door of politics, because I think that's certainly something that I've heard from the people of Wentworth, is this concern about how politicians are not holding up themselves to the standards that the community expects. The community expects politicians, when they're in Parliament and also after in Parliament, to always be acting in the interests of the Australian people and not to be acting in their personal interests or the interests of the party, because that is what they are in government to do. And I think that is certainly an expectation. And I think there are many other aspects in terms of integrity, which I'm sure we're going to get to sometime in the program, that we will be addressing. But I think this is multifaceted, that we should be considering about transparency in who they're meeting, in terms of revolving door after they leave, and also what are the processes for people to be appointed to government boards. Because again, this politicisation of the fundamental tools of Australians' governance is not what people want to see, and it's not expected by the community.
And of course, we're talking about Andrew Robb, the former Trade Minister. We could equally mention Sam Dastyari and, of course, where that ended up for him. But Lavina, just to bring it back to this question about, and this is going to be a theme in the election. We live in times when China hovers over Australia, and it's unavoidable. And the questions of security, Greg raised questions about defence spending, questions of security are going to be front and centre.
Yeah.
When you look, and you spend your time analysing this, you look at the respective merits of the two major parties seeking to form government. Who is the better bet for national security?
Right.
No pressure.
This is the business you're in, Lavina.
Look, I think it's the question was about politicisation of China policy, and I think the government has a lot to be proud of in terms of really taking quite world-leading positions on standing up to China. There are a line of European countries coming to Australia to talk to Australian politicians, policymakers, to say, how do we do this? How do we follow your model? So I really think that the government didn't really need to go down this path. It already has a strong position to sell to the electorate. And I think there's a danger in effectively making the population maybe a little bit cynical about why they did it in the first place. And that's a real problem with politicising the matter, is that people start to wonder, did you do it for the national interest or did you do it for some other political interest? I think in terms of the Labor Party, I think Chris Bowen's correct in saying, and Greg for that matter, that there has been a real strong level of bipartisanship, and that's been a real boon for Australia to have that bipartisanship. But I do think when it comes to the substance, the quote that you raised from Penny Wong's speech about the Anglosphere, for example, I think there are some doubts about whether Labor would have a stronger resolve. And that's not to say that Labor can't dispel those doubts, but I think when you have elder statesmen in the party like Paul Keating or Bob Carr, for that matter, who put forward some quite softer positions, sometimes you might even say a bit defeatist, about China, I think that the current leadership, the current Labor Party probably needs to come out more strongly and refute those positions, not merely say that they disagree with them.
I think they probably were, and I don't know that Bob Carr and Paul Keating would describe it as defeatist, but we'll move on.